With that being said, it's now my great honor to introduce the closing plenary speaker of the SMB 2020 annual meeting on behalf of the organizing committee. Professor Carl T. Bergstrom is an evolutionary biologist and professor in the Department of Biology at the University of Washington, where he studies how epidemics spread through populations and how information flows through biological and social systems. He does this across multiple scales, from the intracellular control of gene expression to the spread of misinformation on social media. In addition, Professor Bergstrom is very interested and active in the science of science and studies how current norms and institutions actually shape our scientific knowledge. The third research focus that we briefly just mentioned already is his work in evolution in medicine and how to exploit evolutionary principles and evolutionary explanations for our vulnerability to disease. Most prominently, due to his recent launch of his latest book, Professor Bergstrom is a proponent of calling bullshit. Together with his colleague Jevin West, he has designed and teaches a course on the art of skepticism in a data-driven world, which is a very important art form, especially for us mathematical biologists who routinely use numbers and graphs to try to communicate our scientific stories. So the closing plenary lecture of our annual meeting is entitled Misinfodemic 2020, how quantitative misinformation misleads the public about COVID-19 and what mathematical biologists can do about it. With that, please join me in welcoming Professor Bergstrom.
Thank you so much. It's really a pleasure and an honor to be here, and I'm looking forward to telling you a little bit about some of the things I've been thinking about ever since February. So I've been working on epidemics and infectious diseases for 20 years, and we knew all along that it was really only a matter of time until something like this happened, and you know, we were just kept getting lucky that things like in 2009 swine flu wasn't as dangerous as we feared it could have been. In 2020, obviously, our luck finally ran out with COVID, and that changed the world that we live in. And among other things, we've all had to become epidemiologists. So these days, when I walk through the grocery store, I'll overhear these snippets of conversation about seroprevalence rates and about R naught and about case fatality rates and things like this, which of course didn't used to happen a year ago. And so the entire public has had to start thinking about epidemiology, and a lot of that being, you know, portrayed, of course, in quantitative form. And the problem being that, you know, as the public is trying to do that, this entire COVID information landscape is full of these falsehoods, and which we'll talk a little bit more about what some of what those are and why they're there. And then the challenge is, of course, few people have the training to see through this sort of quantitative misinformation. So I think we're all fairly good at spot bullshit words, and when you know, if you're hearing, you know, weasel words coming from a administrator or kind of hype from a advertiser or ridiculous, you know, claims from a politician, we're good at seeing that. When it comes to numbers, it's a lot harder because we're not taught to the same degree. I mean, we as members of the, you know, Society of Medical Biology may be have spent our careers doing this, but when we think about the public more broadly, this sort of skepticism around numbers and the way to see through misinformation in the form of numbers isn't something that's taught as regularly and as rigorously. And so part of the problem is that numbers, you know, when people see numbers seem to come straight from nature. They seem to be, they seem to have this sort of like naturalness to them that, you know, they don't have the subjectivity of words. They're objective. You might even say that, you know, to some degree, numbers almost feel like they're carrying this divine authority. They seem replicable. They're universal. They're scientific. They're precise. You know, unlike words that are these sort of subjective, fuzzy products of human minds that are idiosyncratic to the speaker and so on. And because of this, when people are confronted with numbers, they often find themselves sort of deferring to the authority of numerical claims. And that's a big problem. You know, when we teach, even if we're teaching in STEM disciplines, we rarely are teaching our students to question numbers the same way that people do in, you know, people question ideas in a philosophy class or in a literature class or something like that. We are very good at teaching our STEM students to perform mechanics, so they can do various kinds of calculations, they can code things. You know, they're wonderful at dynamic programming or whatever it is. But we don't, at least in my experience, do a very good job of teaching students to think critically, among other things, by exposing them to plausible, convincing ideas that turn out to be wrong in quantitative form that you have to see through. So, so that's kind of the landscape that I want to think about, you know, as we're coming into a public, trying to make sense of what's going on around the coronavirus situation. You know, and we begin in the coronavirus situation with this scientific certainty vacuum. There's a tremendous uncertainty around what is happening, how the virus works, what is going to happen next. We've got a virus that was, you know, not only we don't understand well, but was never even in humans until December 2019, until December 2019, and we're trying to race and make sense of what this virus actually does. But there is this, like, sort of, you know, tremendous uncertainty. This is a recent meta-analysis, just to give you an example, of estimates of the infection fatality rate for coronavirus. And you see this enormous range of infection fatality rates over, you know, more than an order of magnitude. And this is ordered top from bottom by time. So you got February at the top, June at the bottom. And even, you know, in June, you're still getting these order of magnitude differences in our estimates of infection fatality rates. And so we're dealing with a situation where there are these tremendous scientific uncertainties. And when, you know, when asked about these kinds of things, any honest scientist is going to have to say, I don't know, or here's the range, or something like that. But you know, into that sort of uncertainty vacuum flow things like organized disinformation campaigns. So early in January, we were already seeing these rumors coming out that to us, you know, I work with the Center for the Informed Public at the University of Washington, which tracks disinformation and misinformation online, among other things. And, you know, we were seeing these, you know, what we saw as, you know, organized, you know, state-sponsored or similar disinformation campaigns that were pushing out various rumors. So, for example, rumors about elevated sulfur dioxide levels over Wuhan, indicating a large number of bodies being cremated. You know, rumors about where did the 25 million cell phones go in China? Maybe, you know, did tens of millions of people die of COVID? These kinds of things. And that was even, you know, before we saw that this was going to turn into a pandemic. So this is the sort of first wave of what we start to see as things start to come into the United States, and it starts to become clear in late February that we're looking at a really serious situation. Instead of tackling that head on, we start to get the federal messaging kind of leaps onto the disinformation bandwagon. And you know, this is tremendously problematic in a pandemic, because what you need people to trust the messages from the authorities, because you need people to take on the you know, painful mitigation measures that you're asking them to do, whether it's, you know, closing schools, businesses, staying home, wearing masks. And if you undermine your trust right from the start by saying, you know, oh, you got 15 people and in 15 days it's going to be down to 0, or to say, you know, we've already contained this, you know, this is undercutting trust and putting disinformation into that space. We had a bad outbreak of what Noah Haber called DKE-19, Dunning-Kruger effect 19, where people who hadn't you know, really heard the word epidemiology a month ago had decided, well, I know a lot of data science, so I'm sure I can figure this out, and started writing blog posts explaining how things worked, that were giving, again, putting all kinds of misinformation out there because they didn't understand the underlying context. There have been all of these fake studies being put out there, and a lot of astroturfing. So some very fancy work, very nice, high production value web pages and things. This is the one I've got up here. Claim was one that came up recently. Tony Fauci was saying, that there'd never been a proper randomized control trial that has showed any benefit to hydroxychloroquine. And so very quickly, this really professional website that looks exactly like a scientific, or almost exactly like a scientific paper, came up that purports to have done a randomized trial of 2.6 billion people, and puts in this fiction about the countries themselves being randomized onto treatments, and then does some very, very poor analysis and claims that there's an enormous benefit to hydrochloroquine. So we've got all that kind of astroturfing going on. Of course, the scientific process itself, because of the rapid speed with which we're trying to do everything, we're putting all these preprints out there. That's in general, an extremely good thing. So much of the scientific discussion that used to be dark, people emailing paper drafts around, emailing comments back and forth, talking at conferences, talking on the telephone. Now this is all taking place, in the preprint servers, conversations on PubPeer and Twitter and this kind of thing. And that's all very, very good. But of course, there's a lot of garbage that's being put out too. And unfortunately, that garbage is often what explodes across traditional media and across social media. So this is a paper that came out several months ago that claimed that there were similarities greater than chance between a part of the HIV genome and the COVID or the SARS-CoV-2 genome, and that this was evidence that that SARS had been bioengineered. Of course, SARS-2 had been bioengineered. Of course, this is completely false. But it didn't, and the paper was withdrawn, but it didn't stop the paper from racking up one of the highest altmetric scores in the history of altmetrics rankings. So these altmetric scores sort of look at how much attention are these papers getting from traditional and social media outlets. So the problem is that these sort of shocking, the social media and into more and more traditional media as well are sort of optimized for spreading shocking information that keeps you glued to the platform, not for spreading accurate information. Peer-reviewed work has been equally dreadful. At Left, we've got a paper that purported to explain the mechanism for 5G generating spontaneously generating coronavirus particles within skin cells and then transmitting them from place to place. I mean, it's completely incoherent and makes no sense whatsoever. But that was published in one journal of pretty low quality and then subsequently retracted. At Right, we have something a lot more damaging. This was published in The Lancet. This was a paper that claimed that hydroxychloroquine was causing adverse effects in patients that were getting it while hospitalized. This paper published in The Lancet was strong enough to cause a number of hydroxychloroquine trials to be canceled because they felt that the treatment arm was too dangerous. Turned out the entire paper was fraudulent, and that the underlying data probably never existed. So we have all of those kinds of things happening. There's lots of sloppy reporting. I'm going to come back to this particular example later, but the stories that are coming out in the media aren't accurately reflecting the science underneath. There's a lot of what I call cherry picking. These guys are super cute, but cherry picking isn't so cute. Because the pandemic has been so heavily politicized, we have people who are taking, we've got this enormous range of results, right? For any scientific problem, especially when there's a lot of people working on it, you're getting a range of different outcomes. And so, people are trying to, for example, estimate the infection fatality rate. Some people are getting very high, very low estimates. Some people are getting very high estimates. And people are depending on, and then that whole issue has been politicized. And so people on one side of the political spectrum will sort of cherry pick examples of studies that may happen to support their viewpoint. And then people on the other side cherry pick the others, and then they bang at each other with that and create a lot of confusion, and people start to doubt that they can get to, they either believe wrong things or they start to doubt that, scientists have any idea what's going on, or doubt that they could have any chance of getting to the truth. And then, of course, all of this that we're seeing is wrapped up in this authority of numbers. So everything, this is epidemiology, which is fundamentally a statistical, highly quantitative discipline. And so everything is being packaged. It's being done by analyzing numbers. It's being packaged numerically. It's being presented and sold to the public in the form of numbers. And this makes it extremely hard for people to figure out how to get to the truth about what's actually going on. And I think that's where the society fits in, because I think we're unusually well suited to be able to help out here. We're mathematical biologists. This is exactly what we do. We spend our lives thinking clearly about numbers in a biological context. And we, here's a situation where this is a, near existential issue for our society, is the ability to do that. And so as mathematical biologists, I think, we can do a number of things. We can communicate with the public, with the press, on social media. We can put things into context. We can explain things. We can collaborate. There are so many people that are interested in contributing to this effort, and many of them don't have the biological intuition that we have, or some biologists don't have the mathematical skills that we have. And finding those collaborations, myself, I've been working with in particular economists, working a lot with Paul Romer and others who don't have the epidemiological and biological background, but have, a very deep understanding of other pieces of the puzzle that I don't really understand. And so making those connections is extremely powerful. And then, if we want to think about the long game, we can teach. And that's an extremely important thing to do, because while the sort of public skills around quantitative reasoning may be somewhat restricted right now, we can change that. We can't necessarily change that for this pandemic, but we can change it in time for the next one. And that's something that's been really important to me over the last few years. And so the background of that is in 2017, I'd been talking with my colleague, Jevin West, about producing a class on data reasoning. So in 2017, we started to despair that we'd ever be able to actually teach this class, not because we titled it Calling Bullshit, but rather because we were in two separate colleges, and that's an insurmountable obstacle to co-teaching in a university dedicated to interdisciplinary work. So we put this website up. We just made the entire, we made up a fictional class and put up the syllabus, and we wrote all the readings and background and all of that. And we put it up online. So the whole story. We wrote a whole series of case studies of various levels of sophistication, and so on. And we put that up, and the thing went viral overnight, which was tremendously, completely unexpected and exciting for us. And all of a sudden, there were stories being written in all of the national papers and things and about this syllabus, and that gave us the leverage that we needed to convince the university that they actually ought to let us teach it. So we taught the course for the first time in spring 2017. That entire course we designed the lectures to be broken up into little 5 to 8 minute YouTube friendly vignettes. The whole course is available online, and you can watch the videos to that. And then most recently, in the last, just a couple of weeks ago, we finally published our book about this course and about these topics, and that's the book Calling Bullshit. So what I want to do in this lecture is kind of take the lessons from that whole experience that I was going through and the things we were trying to teach, and look at how they play out in the COVID information landscape, if you will. But to do that, I want to start by defining what I'm talking about. So what's bullshit? So for me, bullshit, especially as and here I'm expanding upon Harry Frankfurt, the philosopher's definition from his book on bullshit and so forth, but kind of trying to bring it into focus with respect to quantitative information. So it's language, statistical figures, data graphics, and other forms of presentation that are intended to impress or overwhelm or persuade. So they're sort of persuasive in aim, presented with a blatant disregard for truth, logical coherence, or what information is actually being conveyed. Let me give you an example. This is a quote from Sigmund Freud, from a letter he wrote. He said, "So I gave my lecture yesterday. Despite a lack of preparation, I spoke quite well and without hesitation, which I ascribed to the cocaine I had taken beforehand. I told about my discoveries in brain anatomy, all very difficult things that the audience certainly didn't understand. But all that matters is they get the impression that I understand it. That's classical bullshit. He is intending to impress, to overwhelm, and persuade with a blatant disregard for the information that he's actually conveying. And I'm not going to guess as to whether the remainder of Freud's oeuvre is bullshit or not, but clearly his cocaine-fueled public lecture was. So when we think about quantitative bullshit, one of the basic things to start is just with the way that numbers are presented and misrepresented. And I'm not going to go through that a lot here because I think it's something people are, of course, very familiar with. But if there's, again, these numbers come down from on high, and they feel like they're solid and facts of nature and so on. But of course, the choice of which numbers to show and how to formulate them and so on has a huge impact on the sort of story that they're used to tell. And so there's sort of a key principle that I think is, underlies everything else, which is that, to communicate accurately and honestly with numbers, the numbers have to be presented in ways that allow you to make meaningful comparisons. And if numbers aren't doing that, then those numbers are unlikely to be, then they're prone to be basically thrown out there as this sort of, numerical shock and awe, trying to just impress somebody into agreement or submission or whatever the case may be. So we see this all the time with COVID. There's, these over and over, and this never goes away, that there are these claims that, COVID is no worse than the flu. And so people will say, like COVID, the flu has a fatality rate of 0.1%. And there's two things wrong with this. First of all, the COVID estimate is wrong. It's much too low, but people have come up with estimates like that. But the other really fundamental thing going on here is that these are two different kinds of fatality rates. So the COVID estimates are estimates of infection fatality rate. That's the number of deaths divided by the total number of infections. And this number for flu, which is not very well established, but probably not terrible, is a case fatality rate. This is a death per diagnosed case. So one has to realize is that the case fatality rates are much, much higher than the infection fatality rates, particularly for a disease like flu, where most illness is mild, some is even asymptomatic, because most people never get the test, most people never get it diagnosed. Only the people that are the sickest have it tested, have it diagnosed. So what this is doing is it's comparing numbers with two different denominators. Of course, neither is a rate. They're both ratios, but we call them rates for some stupid reason. This is very common in epi, of course. But the point is like this, this is a way that these misleading comparisons can be sold to you. Numbers can just be used kind of just to, purvey nonsense and just try to make things sound good or bad or whatever. So, Trump says, recently that since March 12th, we've increased daily testing by 32,000%. Been a lot of discussion. I'll talk more about that, about sort of failures in adequate testing in the United States. Okay, but over that same period, the number of daily cases increased by 13,000%, and the total number of cases increased by over 300,000%. So, the 32,000% increase is not necessarily so impressive when you look at it in those light. There's a lot of very basic sort of thinking as a scientist that goes wrong in the media landscape, and also media literacy. So I said I'd come back to this example. This is something that ABC posted just a few days ago, and they said, and it was based on some CDC recommendations that CDC had made for when you needed to test people who had already had COVID and recovered, and when did they need to be screened again. So ABC says people who've been infected with COVID and recovered are protected for up to 3 months. And that led to sort of a mass freak out on the internet, because they thought, well, gosh, we're only getting 3 months of immunity out of COVID. This is sort of the worst thing that could happen. Now there's no hope of getting to herd immunity. Now maybe a vaccine won't work, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And it turned out that this was just a complete misrepresentation by the media, who had misunderstood what was going on. So when we see a claim like this that's either too good or too bad to be true, we always tell our students that probably is. You need to track back to the source. So if you track back to the source of this one, you'll come back to the CDC recommendation. And the CDC actually says that you don't need to get tested again for 3 months. They say up to 3 months, and the word up to is causing some confusion there. But what they're really saying is that it's safe to not test for 3 months after after an infection. So what they're saying is, we don't really know what happens after 3 months because this is a pretty new infection. But for 3 months after infection, you're safe. So what the CDC is saying, in other words, is this is sort of a basic logic thing. If you have, P is within 3 months you're within 3 months of a previous infection, and Q is you can get reinfected. And the CDC is saying P implies not Q. But what ABC reported, and this actually appeared on basically every single major news outlet, which is remarkable to me because I think they have to have been copying each other. It's like when all the kids in your class have the same wrong answer. You're just thinking like that can't happen by accident. So the news outlets reported that not P, so you're not within 3 months of previous infection, implies Q. And of course that doesn't follow. That's not that's not how logic works. Explaining sort of truth tables and things to my students can be hard, so I find it useful. You can explain this in terms of necessity and sufficiency. So the CDC is saying that being beyond 3 months is a necessary condition for being reinfected. But it's being reported in the news as saying that being beyond 3 months is a sufficient condition for reinfection. Whereas we just absolutely don't know because we haven't had the disease with us long enough to say what's going to happen at 4 months and 5 months and so on. So just, helping people think critically about basic scientific information and make sense of that is something that's, I think, absolutely, we have to be doing as researchers and as teachers. Another kind of thing we see a lot of is what I call mathiness. This is equations like this. This is the Virginia Mason Medical Center quality equation, and it says the quality of healthcare you get is equal to the appropriateness of the care times the sum of outcomes and service divided by waste. And this, I guess, there's like books about this, and it's like a huge deal, and so on. But it really, if you look at it, I think you can see how silly it is. What they seem to be saying really is something about partial derivatives, is that the quality is increasing in appropriateness, outcome, and service, and decreasing in waste. And there's no reason at all that I can think of why, and I've certainly never seen them present one, why the BMC MMC quality equation should be the one on left in blue instead of, for example, any of the ones on right in yellow there. And moreover, there are all these issues of units, right? So what are the issues, what are the units of this quality? Outcome and service, first of all, have to be in the same units if we're going to add them together. And then then even if we can do that, then the outcome units of quality, you have to push the dimensional analysis through. And so quality has to somehow be in units of appropriateness divided by waste times whatever our O plus S units are. This is not really making a lot of sense. So this kind of mathiness is bullshit. It's in exactly the sense that I was describing with my definition. It's disregarding logic and factual accuracy. It's trading on an air of rigor that's conferred by these mathematical equations, and trying to impress or persuade an audience using algebraic shock and awe. And so this is just outright misleading, and this is what we've seen in COVID. This is Boris's COVID alert level equation, and he says the COVID alert level is R, the basic reproductive number, plus the number of infections, which is really weird. You're adding a dimensionless constant to a number of infections. Your dimensionless constant is presumably between 0 and 5, or 6 at worst, and the number of infections is in the thousands, tens of thousands. This just makes absolutely no sense, but this was something that got put out there and was trying to look like they were doing math and making hard scientific decisions when it's just rubbish. Another thing we run into is Goodhart's law. So Goodhart's law states is sort of the way that that measuring things can generate problems. So it's originally stated that any observed statistical regularity will tend to collapse once pressure is placed upon it for control purposes. The sort of TLDR version from Maryland Strathern is when a measure becomes a target, it ceases to be a good measure. So we have to think about, when we're making measures into targets, what is that doing? My colleague Jevin West, who's I teach the class with, explained this for scientific metrics like impact factors and things in editorial in Nature a decade ago. And he says, giving bad answers is not the worst thing a ranking system can do. The worst thing it can do is encourage bad science. So you put the ranking system in place, it becomes a target, people start doing bad science in order to gain that ranking. And we're suffering from that dreadfully right now in the United States with respect to our capacity in testing, because all along Trump has treated the epidemic as a public relations crisis, where he's worried about the numbers, not a public health crisis, where you're worried about the actual underlying health outcomes. And so he has steadfastly opposed increasing testing capacity, and the CDC and the FDA and other agencies that report to him have done everything they can to interfere with the development of testing capacity in the United States, because he wants to keep these numbers down. And again, so what's happening there is not only is this, the measure of having low cases has become a target, and not only is that making it not a good measure, but worse yet, it's encouraging bad public health by undermining our testing capacity in the US. One of the places that I think is really fascinating to look at, really important to look at, is issues around data visualization. So when the public interact with data, they're often in the form of visualizations, and there's so much garbage out there around COVID. You see graphs like this. This is a graph from new cases a day, which looks sort of reasonable enough until you start looking at what these gaps are: 30, 30, 10, 30, 30, 30, 50, 10, 50, 50, 50. It boggles the mind. Here's a graph that Georgia released purporting to illustrate sort of declining numbers of cases in various counties across Georgia, and that looks pretty good until you realize that the order of these the order of these sets of bars is completely arbitrary. So you go, May 1st, April 30th, May 4th, May 6th, May 5th, May 2nd, May 7th. And they've sorted these bars by height so that you get this impression of a decrease. You just get plain silliness like this, where you've just made some random bars and put numbers above them to make things look like a bar chart. You get somewhat more insidious graphs like this one. This is a graph that Trump showed to try to brag about testing outcomes in the United States. And he's saying, wow, people are criticizing me for testing, but look what a great job we're doing with the testing. Look at how that's been growing. It's not labeled on here, but this is a graph of cumulative tests in the country, not a graph of tests per day. This is the same trick that Tim Cook got caught doing when he gave this talk for Apple about cumulative. So he's bragging about cumulative iPhone sales, and what he was, of course, covering up is that iPhone sales are falling off over time. But by showing a cumulative plot, cumulative plots, all they can do is go up, and so makes things look okay there. So for helping people kind of see through these graphical tricks and understand this is one of the most fun things that we do in our course. Here's another one. This caused a lot of shock and concern, saying, wow, COVID is almost as bad for young people as for old people. And so you see these bars for the young adults are just as high as the bars for older groups. And the reason that is, of course, is because the bin sizes differ. This is a bin of 25 years compared to these bins of 10 years. So sort of a misleading way to present data there. Here's another one. This is from Georgia's, state of Georgia puts out these maps of pandemic, of sort of case risk. So on July 2nd, the graph looks like this as the sort of, the July wave is hitting. July 17th, it looks like this. You'd think things haven't gotten much worse, but then you actually look at the ranges, and they've just scaled the ranges up so that so all of Georgia's worse, but it doesn't appear on the map. People got very upset about this. And it does bring me to sort of a version of Hamlin's razor that I think is worth mentioning, which is never ascribed to malice what can be adequately explained by incompetence, and never ascribed to incompetence what could be an understandable mistake. And so I suspect what was going on here was that they're using some software package. They've chosen a bad color scheme with this red to highlight the most extreme, and they're using some software package that's automatically scaling the numbers. And so there probably was, counter to what people were saying, I don't think there was any intent to hide the increasing disaster that was playing out in Georgia, but the effect of these of using software defaults and not sort of thinking through it, ended up having that consequence. Here's a fun one. We first CNBC and later Donald Trump tried to put really positive spin on the recovery, on the job recovery that we've experienced over the last couple of months. And so, here we have a CNBC and Trump. We've got this jobs boom. We've got jobs kind of what they're drawing here is the change in the number of jobs. So it's kind of flat, and then you have this terrible fall off, and then it bounces right back up, and you think, oh wow, what a wonderful recovery, job boom in full swing. Look what happens if you graph a baseball game that way. So here's the Mariners' recovery in full swing. I've plotted the run differential each inning, so the Mariners have done very have dropped 5 runs in the 7th and 4 runs in the 8th, but they scored 1 run in the 9th, and this graph then makes it look like they're coming out ahead. So that's the sort of things that can be done with graphics, and the way that you can sort of take metaphors that people are used to and then highlight some of that misleading information. I'll skip that one. And then some of these issues around graphs are a little bit more subtle. So and really involve some kind of serious thinking. Been a lot of discussion about how we should display cumulative death curves in when trying to understand how good or bad the epidemic response has been in different countries. So one possibility is you just show the absolute number of deaths. When you do that, it makes the US look really bad because the US is big compared to a lot of the other countries. Another thing you could do is you could show the per capita deaths. And that makes the US now down here look really, really good because because the US is big. And so now you're putting a big denominator there. So what's the proper way to show something like this? And there were endless arguments about this, and a lot of the cherry picking that we talked about where depending on the political side, people would choose one or the other. It turns out, if you kind of think this through, that you can show these per capita death curves. It's a completely reasonable thing to do. But if you show per capita death curves, you need to have each country start from a constant fraction of cases, not from a constant number of cases. Again, you have to present the numbers in a way that allow you to make meaningful comparisons. So 5 cases in the United States is a much lower number per capita than 5 cases in the UK. So you have to make sure that you're starting from, say 1 in 1 million cases rather than this absolute number. If you do that, then as shown in this picture, you're properly aligning these various countries, and then you can make reasonable comparisons about the sort of rate of growth of the epidemic in different places. Of course, what would be even better for a professional audience would be to simply use logarithmic graphs, but I think these are really hard for the public to interpret. You use a log graph, and now your slopes are the exponential growth rates, your heights are the prevalences, and I don't lose my timing information by having to align everything. So there are of course different ways to look at that data. This is a really interesting one. So this is a picture. This is Deborah Birx showing off the IHME model of the trajectory of the pandemic. And so this is a case where I think data visualization really misled people in an unfortunate way. And so what IHME did was they put together these projections and then got the ear of the White House. And they said, look, here's our prediction of what's going to happen in the United States. And when you look at these predictions, one of the things that you see is this what looks like a confidence range. And in fact, they use this sort of language. They talk about this as a worst case projection. Of course, we've now found that we've done massively worse than this worst case projection. And so both the use of that language, but then also the use of that visual metaphor of confidence ranges really gave you a misleading perception about what these graphs were doing. These weren't worst case forecasts. These were this was a curve fit, and this was sort of the extreme of the curve fit given what they were doing. And so it wasn't really a proper projection. And I kind of pointed this out the day they released this in late March. With epidemics, an epidemic either takes off. It's like a ball rolling down a ridge. If R naught is less than 1, it's going to fizzle. If R naught's greater than 1, most likely once it gets going, it's going to take off and it's going to go spiraling out of control and getting bigger and bigger. So what IHME is doing in their model is they're just assuming that the ball is going to come down this elimination side once the pandemic starts to rise and we put the interventions in place. In fact, what they were doing was they were fitting the initial US data to the late stage Wuhan and Italy curves. And so they're just assuming you're going to come off here, and their confidence intervals don't even include any of the range where you fall off the other side. So here's the Wuhan curve, and that shows things falling off the good news side there. The IHME predictions looked like this for, say, New York and California. They got New York more or less right. New York had a longer tail, but New York did fall off of this side. But they got California completely wrong because California fell off the other side. And then the confidence intervals as displayed didn't include that. The confidence intervals only included what happened if you fell off of this side. And then things get additionally complicated because once you add in human behavior, if we sort of like putting a trough into the into your graph here. Once you start to get more and more cases, R naught gets big, then then people start to get scared and they stay home. Once you get few cases, then people start to relax and go out, and so you get pulled back toward what would otherwise be sort of an unstable equilibrium along the ridgeline there. So this is what we see maybe in places like South Dakota, where you kind of have these long-term flattened out situations. In other cases, you might roll up on one side, roll up one side and then down the other and then off the other end, like in Minnesota. So there are these various kinds of complicated dynamics that weren't taken into account in a model like that. So, here again is the original model, and it's just simply not taking into account the possibility of any of these things happening, which is okay if you're very, very clear about that. But once you put this into the visual language of confidence intervals and such, there was a recent story explaining that Birx hadn't really understood what was going on here, and this was part of why she had been so confident that things were going to go away. The other thing that's kind of interesting about visual language is look at this cone of uncertainty. Doesn't look so weird until you start thinking about well, what does this cone of uncertainty look like when you get part way in? So it's like here's a situation, this is actually from their website, where the prediction is to have, basically they've got no idea what the value is going to be tomorrow, but they know what it's going to be a month out. And that's very different than what we see from hurricanes, where the cone of uncertainty or any kind of reasonable uncertainty prediction, the uncertainty is going to magnify over time, not collapse over time. And that should have been something of a tip off right from the start. Give you a couple. So one of the sort of key lessons in the course as we teach it is that is to try to show students that that you don't have to be have a master's degree in statistics or anything like that to be able to see through this stuff. Don't be intimidated by stats. Just think about think about the statistics as being in a black box. Think about data goes in, output comes out, and then you make some kind of interpretation. And if there's something wrong with the data that goes into the black box, you don't have to understand the stats. You can call out the data. So I'll give you a couple of examples of this in the form of selection bias. There's a story a few days ago where these two dentists in New York had seen that the patients that were coming into their clinic were had more severe gum disease and more severe tooth decay than they were seeing prior to the pandemic. First of all, it's just totally anecdotal and so on, but then you stop and so then from this they concluded, wow, masks must be harming your teeth. Masks, there must be something about masks that's maybe the carbon dioxide or something is causing tooth damage and gum damage. And they didn't think about the fact that who on earth goes to the dentist in New York right now if they're not suffering from serious ailments that would push them to go in. Nobody wants to go to the dentist for their regular cleaning, and people are putting things off as long as they can. So they didn't think about how that change had taken place. We saw this in dramatic fashion with these doctors in Bakersfield who were claiming that there was this very, very low infection fatality rate. What they did was they tested all the patients that came into their clinic. In March, they found that about 6.6% of those patients were positive. From that, they concluded that a similar number were positive in all of California, and therefore were able to make a high incidence estimate. which would imply an extremely low infection fatality rate. But of course, the obvious mistake in doing this is that the people who go into an urgent care facility during the start of a pandemic are not random samples from the population. They are largely people who've either had some kind of severe accident that needs immediate care or that think they actually have COVID. So this was their estimate was off by orders of magnitude, but that didn't stop them from, because of this cherry picking stuff, they became sort of right-wing media darlings and showed up the next night on Laura Ingraham's Sink or Mingle and so on. And then, I think the very worst place that this hit us is actually in the U.S.'s initial testing plan for how we were going to ascertain whether or not there was domestic spread of COVID, whether we had person-to-person spread taking place in the United States. And the guidelines for who could get tested for COVID were that you had to either have traveled to Wuhan or you had to have been exposed to a known US case. These guidelines, if you pause and think about it for just a minute, guarantee that you will not uncover person-to-person spread you will not uncover, quiet person-to-person spread in the United States. You'll uncover transmission chains coming out of Wuhan that you know of. But if it's spreading in the US like it was in Seattle for a month before anyone detected it, there's no chance that you'll pick it up because you're only testing people who are not members of that, silent domestic spread that you're trying to find. So that was a amazing example of selection bias that was guaranteed to fail in what they were trying to do. I'm going to skip this as a little Bergson's paradox example, and I'm just going to finish up with the other side of this graph, which is the fact that you can also just think about how you go from the output of one of these, some sort of data science analysis or statistical analysis to the interpretation, stressing this to our students that, again, if the data seem okay, you don't understand this part, that's fine. Think about that as being in a black box. Think about whether the interpretation is consistent with the output. So, so this was a paper that came out recently. It says bald men are at higher risk of severe coronavirus symptoms. And so the idea was, and so here we want to tell people to think about correlation and causation. And so what's been observed is that there's this correlation between baldness and COVID risk. The authors hypothesized an endocrine pathway. They had a whole elaborate story about the endocrine mechanisms by which androgens were making people more susceptible to COVID and so forth. And then the problem with this was, as you see here, this piece has been clarified to note that the study did not control for age, which is a risk factor for hair loss and severe COVID-19. So, again, by just sort of looking at this, you can see right through it without thinking about the statistical analysis or anything else, that here you have an obvious common cause for both baldness and COVID risk, and uncontrolled, that's clearly going to lead to this correlation this spurious correlation that you see. So I think I'm going to jump over. I was going to talk a little bit, and I just wrote a little bit more than I should have. I was going to talk a little bit about the kind of things that we can do here in the societies, which is we also know how to open this black box. I think I'm going to pass over that so we can spend some time on Q&A, and so I want to just close with a couple of take-home messages for everybody. And my feeling is we're drowning in bullshit, and a whole lot of it is in quantitative form. Much of the time, this bullshit is not necessarily a huge deal. It's used in advertising. It's used in various kind of political nonsense. But the COVID pandemic has put it into this life or death context where everyone in the world is reading numbers, thinking about numbers, trying to understand their future and plan for their future based on numbers. And there's so much misinformation that's being injected deliberately and by accident and other ways. We need to help with this because people don't have the training they need. And our society needs this kinds of skills that we have in being able to think clearly about this numerical information, put it into a biological context, ask the right questions. We're needed. We're needed to speak to the public. We're needed to, we need to interact with people on social media, talk to the news, to to collaborate with others who need our mathematical and biological skills. And ultimately, and I think this is so important and what this talk is really about, is to find ways to teach our students to think critically about numbers as we move forward, so that we can create a generation that will be as good at seeing through these kinds of manipulations as they are to, you know, false promises of politicians and the likes. So with that, thank you very much for giving me the chance to speak to you, and I would be happy to take questions.
All right, thank you, Carl, so much. That was very beautiful. We do have quite a few questions that have come in, so please allow me to read some out for you. The first one is from Kit Curtis, asking, could you share an example where a complex problem was handled well by the government and media to describe these numbers effectively to the public and positive effects were seen in public health? Successes we can learn from.
Oh, successes we can learn from. Boy, trying to think of, I mean, there, you know, I think every single success has been tempered by opposition on the part of, I mean, every single thing in this pandemic has been politicized. It's so strange. You know, for when I was working on pandemic preparedness through, you know, the 20-aughts, there were really intense debates about, you know, how much should it be government versus public investment and things like that. But we always assumed that if the big one hit, we'd all be on the same page. And so it's so weird to see these, you know, intensely partisan fights over things that, you know, like whether masks work or whether hydroxychloroquine works or whatever. So I think for every single problem out there, we have seen those kinds of fights playing out. Unfortunately, I think that, you know, in the United States, we really haven't handled all of this particularly well. There's not an element of the pandemic response that I can point to and say, wow, they really nailed that. You know, I think that the fact, you know, there are some things that went well. The fact that our hospital capacity was never overrun is a very, very good, you know, was a very good thing. We didn't end up like Lombardy, and some reasonable fraction of that was because people, you know, I've been very critical of the IHME model and would have talked more about it if I'd had more time. But, you know, the fact that they found ways to use mathematical models to try to estimate hospital needs really drew attention to the urgency of that problem and the need to flatten the curve. And so I think that, you know, communicating that to people, that this pandemic wasn't just about how many people are going to get sick, but about what's the relative timing of that, that if everybody gets sick at the same time, we're going to end up like Lombardy, where people, you know, aren't going to be able to have hospital beds, and that maybe that was a reasonable success.
Okay, great, thank you. The next question is from Philip Altrock. How can we learn more about studies that address subjectivity and credibility of arguments with or without numbers? Where do we start? How reproducible are these kind of studies?
Oh, that's a great question. I haven't looked into that as much as I ought to. There are a number of people that are starting to look. I mean, there's this sort of field of, you know, what I would call bullshit studies, essentially, that's starting to look into the susceptibility, and use sort of quantitative methods from psychology and related disciplines to look into people's susceptibility to misinformation, and also people's sort of ability to self-deceive, if you will, and to sort of rationalize what they're seeing. So there are people like David Rand, who are at the Sloan School, who are doing really nice work in that respect. There's also, you know, sort of a field within human-computer interface, essentially in HCI, where they're studying the way that people take information from graphs. That's where I've seen the most of that, is in HCI. What I haven't seen in HCI is the component where you add the sort of deliberate misinformation. But I guess that's, you know, that's my kind of initial answer would be, you know, looking at HCI. You know, the other places, you know, thinking about visualization, is there's a nice book, How Charts Lie, and I feel terrible. I'm suddenly blanking on the author's name, but anyway, there's that kind of thing is good.
So Simon Mitchell asked if you would have any advice to someone who spends too much time trying to fight misinformation on Facebook, and what works and what doesn't.
What works and what doesn't? I don't know. I've spent an enormous amount of time, unsuccessfully fighting misinformation on Twitter for the last 7 months. You got to cut your losses with some people. They're just not arguing in good faith, and you can figure that out usually pretty quickly. I think, a lot of people that are arguing may be paid antagonists, if you will. What I've found most effective, in my own use of the medium is that once you get a little bit of reach, it gives you a direct conduit to the national traditional media. So for example, when I found that the CDC had inexplicably included, so the CDC put out modeling guidelines that all federal agencies had to use, and that they were trying to get research labs to use. And so there was a set of 5 parameter sets for COVID, and in them they'd inexplicably divided the infection fatality rate by 3. Everything else was reasonable, but the infection fatality rate was 1/3 of what it should be. Which is kind of striking because it's such a dumb way to try to fudge the numbers. I mean, you should have fudged everything by 10%. You could have had the same result, and I never could have called them out on it. But in any case, they did this dumb thing and posted these. And in that case, I wrote a post about it, and 3 hours later, I was on the phone with CNN, and it was all over the national news the next day. So I think, looking for those leverage points, and understanding that, a one-on-one argument with a troll isn't going to do much good, but trying to find where the leverage is helpful.
Okay, so we have another 35 questions. I am not going to be able to read all of those out. So what I would like to ask you, if you were at all available to, maybe you have some time to go through the chat and the Q&A after we are done, and maybe help answer some of those questions.
Oh, I'd be happy to. That'd be great. Yeah.
Otherwise, we're going to try to record all these questions, and we will forward them to you afterwards and see if we can get a bulk response that we can share with the participants.
Of course, yeah. Thanks so much to everybody for listening. I hope this stuff was somewhat interesting as a.
Before we let you go, though, I think I will reserve one question from myself.
Please.
Before formally thank you. You mentioned it a couple of times that mathematical biologists may have and probably should have a role in these discussions about the modeling infectious diseases, forecasting, predicting responses, using the scientific knowledge that we have to communicate things adequately and properly. So looking back, not many math biologists were sitting at the table. How do you recommend, can a society like ours, members like we have and listening to you just now, how would you recommend us getting more involved?
It's, it's tricky. I think that our government was uniquely unwilling to listen to professional epidemiologists, because they kept saying what the government didn't want to hear, which is that this is serious and it's going to be bad. And so in this particular case, that was particularly difficult. In general, I think there are multiple levels on which people can get involved, right? I mean, so you can dive right in deep into the epidemiology and start basically doing epidemiology. Not everyone wants to do that, of course, but this is a time in in history, which is, I think, really unusual, where mathematical biologists are basically rock stars, because this is what everybody wants to know about. And even if you're not an expert in epidemiology, there's a lot you know how to think about numbers, and you know how to think about things like exponential growth and nonlinear dynamics and things like that. So it doesn't take so long to get a pretty decent handle on what's going on, and everybody wants to know. And so there are opportunities for public outreach everywhere, whether it's in the schools, whether it's on the local news channel, on social media, working with a museum. I mean, I've done all of these, of course, and these kinds of opportunities are there. And then in terms of finding how to get involved, I really believe so strongly in collaboration. Finding the right teams to work with. So in addition to collaborating a lot with economists, one of my most unexpected and fun collaborations was with a hockey analyst who just called me up and said, like, a brilliant mathematician, right, and lover of the game, called me up and said, I really want to help. What can I do? Like, here's some stuff I've been thinking about, and we worked together to build something to basically do kind of model forensics on IHME's model, and in that case, it was just a matter of reaching out and finding the right collaborations. And then he had these skills where, I'd say, hey, it'd be really neat if we slice the numbers this way. And then, like, before I was done talking, he'd written a Python script, and boom, the whole thing was on my screen, and things that would take me a day to do. It was remarkable.
Okay, great. Thank you so much. So, of course, this couple of minutes got the question count up to 45. So we're going to keep you busy for a little while.
Okay.
But on behalf of the organizing team and all of our members, thank you so much. We appreciate your time.
Oh, thank you so much. Really an honor, and I appreciate it. Thanks to everyone who was listening. I appreciate that.